Okay, hello everyone. So we're ready. A very good afternoon to all of you. I am Nilanjana, and on behalf of Brookings India, I welcome you to a discussion on the World Development Report. This is an annual flagship report of the World Bank, and the theme of the report this year is Trading for Development in the Age of Global Value Chains. So we'll begin today's session with Dr. Aditya Mattu presenting key messages from the report to highlight the India story. Dr. Mattu is the Chief Economist of the East Asia and Pacific region of the World Bank and a co-director and lead author of this report. We're delighted to have him represent the World Bank team to shed light on the potential for India to strengthen GVCs. And he'll present for about 40 minutes. The presentation will be followed by a discussion moderated by Professor Rajesh Chadha. He's the Program Director of Natural Resources at Brookings. He was formerly the Research Director at NCAER, and Professor Chadha has worked extensively on regional and multilateral issues pertaining to international trade. Our panelists for today's session are Dr. Harsha Vardhan Singh, a Senior Fellow of the Council on Emerging Market Enterprises at Tufts Fletcher School. Dr. Singh has worked for over 3 decades on international trade policy, infrastructure regulation, and global governance. He also served as the Executive Director of Brookings India in the past. And we are joined by Professor Amita Batra, a professor of economics at the School of International Studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University. Her areas of expertise are trade policy issues and economic integration in South and Southeast Asia regions. We will wrap up today's session with opening the floor to questions from the audience, so I request you all to please save your questions for the last session. I'll now invite Dr. Mattu to make the presentation. Aditi, can we have the presentation, please?
Can you hear me already? I think this is a little precarious, this floor, so if you don't mind, thank you very much for coming. Sorry. It's been 30 years since the World Bank did a report on trade, and this report is meant to describe the new face of trade, the age of global value chains. As you all know, I should ask one question. How much time do we have?
40 minutes.
For the presentation?
That's 40 minutes for your presentation.
Okay, thank you. Remarkable improvements in information, communication, transport technology, combined with dramatic liberalization of trade, has made it possible to fragment production across national boundaries. It's not just goods, but a range of services have been liberated from the confines of a factory and now are being produced in different parts of the world. In parallel, services too are being fragmented. You used to walk into a hospital. I don't know if I'm hearing the echo or if everyone else is. Maybe I should just. Thank you. Is this better? Okay. So, in parallel, there has been a fragmentation of services production. Instead of everything being produced within the 4 walls of a hospital, there's a range of services now, whether it's the transcription or the diagnostics are being outsourced to different countries. You all know that well. And in this new finer division of labor, we wanted to conceptualize what does it mean, a global value chain. And we focus essentially on one single idea, which is the idea of importing to export. Now, when you think of India, you think of, say, rough diamonds coming from South Africa, which are then polished and exported as jewelry. You think of chemicals, bulk chemicals being imported from China, which then become formulations and medicaments that are exported. And those we think of as backward participation in global value chains, which means importing inputs, which then become part of your exports. The other dimension is forward participation. India sells iron ore to China, which becomes part of China's steel or other manufactured goods exports or industrial exports. India designs software chips, which then are used to make chips in South Korea and exported onwards. So these are different ways in which essentially importing to export happen, or you export, which then becomes part of other countries' exports. Now, all countries participate in global value chains, but they participate in different ways. Somebody here said they were a literature student. This is like a line from Anna Karenina. But many countries that the World Bank cares most about in Africa and Central Asia are located at the base of these global value chains. They produce natural resources and agricultural goods, things like copper and cocoa, which become wires and semiconductors and chocolates when they are exported to other countries. A few countries now, from Bangladesh to Cambodia to even Ethiopia, have broken into the simple manufacturing stage. They moved out of commodities and begun to import cloth to make clothes or leather to make shoes. Other countries have moved on to more sophisticated participation, where they import, for example, semiconductors to make computers which are exported, or import computers, as India does, to produce sophisticated services, knowledge-intensive services, which are then exported. And finally, there are the relatively few countries which are at the cutting edge, producing innovative goods and services. Now, I should say that this is an oversimplification. Many of the standard measures of global value chain participation, some of you have probably worked with these measures, are blind to how countries participate. They simply measure quantitatively what the extent of import is and how it relates to exports. What we try to do is give it more texture. But this is inadequate because, when you think of a country like India or China, it doesn't participate in just one way. It does relatively basic stuff, exporting, as I said, iron ore to China, but it does also relative simple manufacturing, shoes and shirts from cloth and leather. Then it does sophisticated stuff, and it also does, satellite services, which is really at the cutting and innovative edge. But this is meant to capture the sort of dominant way, and one of the questions, the central questions in this report is, does it matter how you participate? And if it does, what can you do about it? Acting alone, nationally, and acting cooperatively with other countries. This is an important time to ask this question, but before I go into the details of why at this juncture this question has particular relevance, is to ask ourselves, and it's worth pausing because we struggled with this question, what makes global value chain different from conventional trade? I finally converged with my colleagues on two aspects which distinguish global value chain trade from conventional trade. One is hyper-specialization. That where in the past you made entire products, whether it was cars and computers within the confines of a country, now it is possible for countries to specialize in specific parts and tasks. And there is a progressively finer division of labor. It's like Adam Smith and David Ricardo on steroids. And the implication is that there is much greater scope for learning by doing, much greater scope for economies of scale. There are whole villages in China which produce only buttons. This is like, Adam Smith's example of the head of or the tip of the needle. The second dimension is that a lot of these transactions are not anonymous transactions on spot markets. These are transactions that take place in the context of durable relationships, sometimes within the same firm between, say, the headquarter and the subsidiary, sometimes between firms in the context of contracts. When you think of Apple and Foxconn, Foxconn produces parts for Apple again and again. Sometimes it's an implicit contract. I simply come back to somebody I trust again and again. Now, why does that matter? Because this joint production creates a mutual stake in improving quality and productivity, and therefore incentives to transfer technology. So the first hyper-specialization increased productivity through scale, static and dynamic economies of scale. The second increased productivity through diffusion of technology. So our report looks at what drives participation, what you inherit in terms of your endowments of labor, skilled and unskilled capital, where you are, how big you are, and what institutions you have. For example, legal institutions, customs institutions, regulatory institutions. We then look at the outcomes that we care about. How does participation in global value chains contribute to productivity or growth? How does it help to generate better jobs, reduce poverty? Does it come at the expense of increased inequality and damage for the environment? And we look beyond this to policies that influence how you participate and to policies that shape outcomes. Today, these questions have added relevance because this engine, which saw remarkable growth in the 90s, is beginning to splutter. Hey, Swami. We come to a stage where not just has growth slowed down, but growth has begun to decline. Now, why is that happening? I think it's a really important question to which we don't have a definitive answer, but I'll quickly list 4 candidates, 2 more interesting than the others. One is a generalized reduction in growth globally, especially a change in its composition away from investment, which tends to be import intensive and global value chain intensive. Second, the fact that China has progressively become self-sufficient. Where it used to import a lot of intermediate sophisticated components, it is beginning to make them itself. The third is changing technology. Conjecture that automation and 3D printing might cause these value chains to shrink and bring production closer to the consumer. And finally, protection. Not so much its level, but the unpredictable and the uncertainty which inhibits investment in relationships. If Foxconn is no longer certain about whether it will be able to sell to Apple, its willingness to make the kinds of investment in the relationships that constitute a global value chain will be diminished. Let me state the punchlines that come from our report up front. First, and you see, I tend to present with great conviction, sometimes things for which there is flimsy data or flimsy evidence, but this is not one of those cases. The first punchline, that if you can jump on this train, there is compelling evidence at the firm level, at the sectoral level, at the country level, that there is a big boost to productivity, to growth, better jobs, and reduced poverty. I think the evidence, it's hard to jump on this train, but if you do, this is the Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam story. Mixed evidence that it may actually contribute to increased inequality, but in a subtle way, because fundamentally these are forces of convergence which are making the world a more equal place. But the gains from participation might be distributed unequally. And finally, and I think less doubt, that there is unquestionably a downside for the environment. The punchline was that nevertheless, even despite these twin threats of automation and protection that I spoke about, development can still take place through global value chains, provided countries like India implement deeper reform and countries like the United States pursue open, predictable policies. It's not a terribly interesting conclusion, but I can tell you that it was quite a controversial conclusion at this stage to be able to say that one side is departing from openness and another side is laggard in terms of the reforms that they're implementing. Now, what I propose to do in order to sort of leave more time for discussion is to focus a little bit more on the India story. And here the most interesting thing is that India has both underachieved and overachieved in global value chains. It has failed to take advantage of that first transition I mentioned, from commodities to basic manufacturing. There, its involvement has been at best half-hearted. And as I said, that's the transition where you get the biggest boost to growth and the biggest growth in jobs. It has, in a sense, got a double promotion. It has made a precocious transition to more sophisticated participation. So the cloth, importing cloth to make clothes, importing leather to make shoes, it never fully exploited. But importing computers to make sophisticated services and importing petroleum to make petrochemicals or chemicals to make medicines, that sophisticated stuff, it has been relatively successful. Now, that raises two questions. Has India missed the bus on basic manufacturing, especially these two threats, protection and automation? And can India live by services alone? And the answer to that is no, it's not too late. Both questions, no. That technological change at this stage is more boon than curse, and this is some of the most interesting, innovative results that come from our report. And protectionism is not inevitable. It does depend on how a country like India forms coalitions and engages globally. The services story, again, I'll show you some interesting evidence, is inherently at this stage an implausible story, because to rely on services alone would require a ridiculously fast rate of growth of skill generation in order to be able to draw enough people out of poverty. What is to be done? Again, walking on two legs, deeper reform to remedy the weaknesses in manufacturing, but also to consolidate strength in services. People kept asking me as I was presenting this report, what about RCEP? Is this the big disaster walking out of it? I don't think this is central, but where international cooperation, which people like Manmohan Kumar and Harsh are deeply familiar with, the missed opportunities, is that it can be used to spur domestic reform in return for securing access to markets. So it's not necessary, because the whole big issue is the domestic reform agenda. But there is a conceivable, a certain dynamic there where you could have done that. Now, it's hard for me to judge how much was on offer. But finally, and perhaps again, one of the more innovative, interesting parts of this report is that for trade to stay open and beneficial, we need meaningful cooperation beyond trade in new areas. And I'll come back to that. Let me now show you some evidence which we spend a long time collecting, for example, at the firm level. It's very interesting that firms that import to export, do both, tend to be more productive than firms that don't trade, and also more productive than firms that do just one. Again, for the reasons that I described. Part of it is hyper-specialization, part of it is the transfers of technology that are involved in the global value chains. This isn't just true at the micro firm level, but at the aggregate country level, event studies show that the big boost to growth came when you make that first transition. I keep saying commodity transition. This is the Bangladesh, Cambodia, Vietnam transition, where you break into basic manufacturing. Subsequent transitions to more advanced manufacturing services also bring growth, but the incremental boost is not quite as large, nor is it with the transition to innovative activities. Now, one legitimate concern that people like Danny Roderick have raised is that, look, in order to participate in these global value chains, firms have to become more capital intensive. Why? Again, there is no evidence, but the conjecture is the kind of precision that is required to make intercompatible parts is hard to achieve with clumsy hands. It requires machinery. So that creates the concern. If firms are more productive and more capital intensive, then are they really generating more jobs? And here is, I think, the central analytical insight of the report. that the productivity effect dwarfs the substitution effect. That the firms that are participating have grown so much and grow so much in scale that they have ended up generating far more jobs than firms who are left out of these chains. So even though they're generating fewer jobs per unit output, they are expanding faster and growing faster and therefore generating many more jobs. And then it's not a surprise that if your firms are becoming more productive and generating better jobs, that in a country like Vietnam, when you look at the change in participation by sub-regions, and this was interesting data we were able to find, those are the sub-regions which have seen the fastest reductions in poverty. One other picture now about India. If you look at the share of global value chain trade in the world, it peaked at around 52% just before the crisis, more than half. India saw growth but peaked about a quarter less, at 38%. This is the first part of its underachievement. If you're interested, I'll just spend a second more on this slightly more complex chart, which shows the relative growth in backward participation and forward participation. Here I was surprised. My conjecture was, you see, backward participation, which is importing parts and components and raw materials to make exports, is primarily a manufacturing phenomenon. In agriculture, where I'm talking about iron ore or software design, more participation is forward participation. India's software designs go to foreign firms who then export to other countries. India iron ore goes to China, which then makes steel to export. I had expected that India would have seen faster growth in forward participation because of the slightly colonial pattern of trade that is emerging vis-a-vis China and the importance of services in its exports. But it turned out, to my surprise, that actually backward participation has grown more. And then I rationalized it on the basis of a very nice book that ICRI has produced, which has nice case studies which show, for example, how important rough diamond imports are to export jewelry, crude petroleum for petrochemicals, basic chemicals for medicaments and sort of pharmaceuticals. So there is that participation and it's non-trivial. But this is a nice picture from the economic survey of a couple of years ago, which shows the underachievement in basic manufacturing. Zero is the year of takeoff into growth for all these countries. For Korea, it is 70s, for China, it's 80s, India is 80s. And if you look at it, the average rates of growth in areas like apparel and leather during this takeoff phase were between 20 and 25% for these other countries. For India, it was like 10 or 5%. So this is, I think, a very nice way of seeing why that first transition where the biggest boost to growth comes and the biggest increase in jobs, good jobs comes, India has underachieved. The second, again, is not novel, and you know that in services, for example, as a share of exports, India is an underlier. It has a higher share of services exports than even the United States and Europe. This chart, I think, is something that we should all focus on, because it's a mystery for me that I haven't. I asked my co-panelists, did they have a good answer? In 2012, the share of trade in India's GDP was 56%, much higher than the share of trade in China. In 2018, this share had fallen by 13 percentage points to 43%.
These are gross values or it's
gross.
Value added?
Right now, gross values. This is gross values. One possible conjecture is that the denominator, GDP, was actually exaggerated. But that can't be the whole answer because services are relatively flat. If that was the case, then even services share would have diminished. But I'm not saying to you an answer, but I'm saying basically this idea that, again, I was presenting in Mumbai, they said, what about this argument that India must produce, it's a large country, produce for its domestic market? I think fundamentally misses the point that if you're not competitive anywhere. A foreign productive firm can compete you out of your domestic market unless you have prohibitively high protection. But look at this, in China too has seen a decline in its share. The world share is virtually flat. China saw a decline, but that was part of conscious rebalancing away from dependence on exports. And there is a recognition of that. I think India's decline, I haven't seen it attract the kind of attention that it deserves to, because for a country which a tiny share in global trade can't blame slowing external trade for its predicament. And it is essentially the domestic. But having come to that, let me say that this technological demon of automation has, for the moment, I think produced more benefits than costs. Because interestingly what we find, and this is carefully done research, that the areas, now when you can actually calculate the potential exposure to automation by looking at the structure of your exports and how likely it is that they're going to be robotified. And India is certainly vulnerable. But interestingly today, when you look at the sectors where robotification has advanced the most, and car production is the one that you have seen the fastest growth in use of robots. That's precisely the sector which has seen the fastest growth in imports from developing countries. And the idea is again that same logic that I said. The productivity and scale boosting effects of technological change. Automation has increased the scale and productivity of American firms making cars, so their need for components from Mexico and other countries which have not yet been automated has grown much faster. And when you combine it with the other trade cost reducing aspects of technology, we conclude that at this stage it's unquestionably more boon than curse. There are downsides. Here is again a very interesting piece of evidence that we were able to put together. When you look at increased participation in global value chains, we have Japan here, but it could have been the United States. And you look at markups. Markups is how much a firm is charging a price which is higher than its cost of production. That markup in industrial countries has increased. But in developing countries like Bangladesh, India, it's declining. This is what I meant about the gains from participation being distributed unequally. Again, conjecture. There are companies, say like Zara, which buys t-shirts from Bangladesh and sells them abroad to other parts of the world. I think it has developed, thanks to its advertising, its branding, its marketing, a certain degree of market power, which means it's able to price higher than its basic cost of production. It also has monopsony power when it is buying from 100 firms which are producing identical shirts and killing each other for the privilege of being able to sell to Zara. So that raises a question. Again, this is circumstantial evidence. You need to deduct from these markups all the legitimate sources for higher price cost margins. But it does raise a question about competition policy, which I'll come back to at the end. One final point, that there is an inequality dimension also on the gender basis. That, we've seen pictures of Bangladeshi firms which employ a lot of women, but there are very few managers, very few owners. So even on the gender side, inequality is a concern. This is, I think, one of the more interesting points which we try and make in the report. You see, collecting taxes is always hard. But it becomes harder in a world of fragmented production, especially when inputs are intangible. And the IMF has done nice work which shows how much developing countries lose in tax revenue due to various practices, from transfer price dubiousness to tax competition. But the chart that I find most striking is this one. The blue shows you the corporate tax rate. The green shows you the tax rate of the top 1% of income earners. And the maroon or purple, I'm a little colorblind, shows you the tax paid by the median worker or the middle class. This is for about 65 countries over 30 years. You see, as economists, the case for free trade always has been that it expands the size of the cake, but the cake is going to be distributed unequally. The losers can, in principle, be compensated by taxing the winners. But in a world where not just trade, but factor mobility is also globalized, where the winners like capital and skills can escape to low tax jurisdictions, that breaks apart. And that, I think, helps us to understand why there is such a strong backlash against globalization. Because the industrial country worker is suffering what they would say a double whammy. They are losing from globalization, and instead of being compensated are also increasingly, because of their immobility, bearing the burden of taxation. So that's my first piece of evidence for my point that to keep trade open, we need to cooperate beyond trade. On the environmental thing, in the interest of time, I'm going to rush, but if there's interest, we can come back to it. There's no doubt that this back and forth movement of components leads to greater transport, therefore greater emissions. And also, if you wrap these little components in plastic, there's more waste. But it's also true that some of these lead firms have become more sensitive to environmental standards because their consumers care, and therefore they are ensuring a higher standard of production, a cleaner standard of production along the value chain, even in countries where the regulator may not care as much about it. It's also true that a lot of these new environmental goods, whether it's solar panels or electric cars, are cheaper and better thanks to global value chains. But on balance, I think there's no question that the environmental effects of hyper-specialization are negative and crave for greater, stronger environmental policy, both nationally and globally. We look at what drives participation, and here we spent a lot of time dealing with this devastating question, what is new? After all, the prescriptions are the old prescriptions. We tried to tailor them as far as possible to stages of participation. What does it take to move from commodities to basic manufacturing, from basic to more advanced, from advanced to innovative? And there are some interesting unusual findings which we can talk about if there's time, but fundamentally, you don't need to be a prisoner of what you inherit. Your limitations and endowments can, for example, of capital and technology by being open to foreign investment. Your isolation can be mitigated by being open in transport and communication. And we see that a lot of countries in Africa, and perhaps to some extent India, hurt themselves and deepen their isolation by restricting competition in transport. Your market size limitations can be overcome by allowing your firms to import from abroad what cannot be made at home and export more easily and escape the confines of a narrow domestic market. And finally, institutions are a challenge, and to some extent, for example, in Eastern Europe, deeper integration has also helped to remedy institutional weaknesses. But coming back to India, again, this is not terribly new, but if I can cast it in a slightly different light to explain both the underachievement and the overachievement, you can think of the four relatives. That where, for example, how India has effectively, even though its endowments are like those of China, it behaves like Singapore. Why? In its structure of trade. Because while its unskilled market has variety of rigidities and hidden costs, its skilled market is relatively flexible. It's striking that nearly 80% of firms in India employ less than 50 workers, and only 15% in China have a similar scale. So the big gain in China in standardized product has come from reaping economies of scale. 10% of firms in India employ more than 500 workers, thrice as many employ more than 500 workers in China. When you look at transport costs, Preetam Banerjee, from whom I learn all this, shows me how this liberalization or privatization of container transport has really not produced meaningful results because of cross-subsidization from passengers, of passengers from domestic, and domestic is subsidized relative to international transport. The result that moving goods domestically in India is 3 times more expensive than China, and that won't surprise you, but twice more expensive than Bangladesh. Trade policy fails to recognize the simple logic that the world is about importing to export. One nice story I was struck by. China for many years has been exporting at more than $30 billion worth of ballpoint pens. But it could not make the tip of the ballpoint pen because that required extremely hard metal which could be made extremely thin and then shaped by ultra precision machinery. And that came from Japan. But that built this huge industry which employed millions of people. It's only 2 years ago that China finally cracked the secret of the tip of the ballpoint pen. But you see, Bangladesh was not cursed with a domestic textile industry. It imported to export. Nandita and I were told this story by our country director who's from Bangladesh. In Bangladesh, they viewed their own apparel industry with some contempt. They said, what do? You don't make anything. You stitch and cut. Everything comes from China and goes away. But Bangladesh's share of garments is 7% of the world today. 8? Oh, this time is moving. But the whole point is that sometimes it is this hubris of believing that you can do everything means you end up doing nothing well. And this is, I think, the central insight of the world of global value chains, that you need to make it easy to import in order to export. And finally, even services reform, where there has been remarkable changes and improvements, is incomplete. You know, we did a study of horticulture for the Ministry of Commerce, and I struggled with this question of why did everybody complain about the fact that retail was restricted. And then it has become apparent to me that in order to invest in these vertical logistics chains, whether it's cold storage, you need scale. Now, in principle, you can achieve that scale through farmers' cooperatives, but it hasn't happened. And that's why even the development of domestic value chains, which link into global value chains, is being inhibited by all these restrictions. But there are exceptions. And this is a question which I'm struggling with. And this is a question for all of you, and I hope I provoke some response. Is the automotive components industry an example of successful infant industry protection, whether through tariffs or whether through local content requirements? Because that's an area where there is certainly a positive development of domestic and global value chains. But let me show you one thing which relates to some work we did, because these new data we put together lets you measure employment not just in the sector, but indirectly in the sectors that supply the sector. And you know, if you look at think of this, if you give me some degree of poetic license, as the labor content. This is $1,000 of services exports, $1,000 of manufacturing exports. This is unskilled employment. This is skilled employment. Notice one thing striking, that the total unskilled employment generated by $1,000 of services exports. Think Infosys. Infosys employs skilled people, but in order to supply, they build through construction, Infosys buildings, they feed their workers, they transport their workers, and so on. In fact, it generates more unskilled value added than manufacturing. Now, you might say, hey, this is the distorted Indian manufacturing. No, it's comparable with the undistorted Chinese manufacturing. But of course, the difference is that in order to generate that unskilled employment, you need far more skills in services than you would need them in manufacturing. And so it's again a fairly obvious point that the problem is not skill intensity, It's skill scarcity. That you could live by services alone, but that would require remedying the dysfunctional skill production function. And that is, I think, something worth keeping in mind. We look at policies for benefiting from global value chains, and we contrast, for example, the stinginess of American support for trade adjustment with the generosity of Denmark, and see that stinginess also a reason for the backlash, that the Anglo-Saxon countries which are at the cutting edge of innovation, while they were at the cutting edge and pushing the frontier, the cake was expanding. Compensation was a secondary issue. But once there was catch-up and convergence, they were the least well equipped to deal with the costs of adjustment. And that's why they have seen the worst backlash. Even in developing countries like Bangladesh, there is a real concern. I used to take the Rana Plaza example, now I can take the old Delhi example. That there is a real worry that this craving for competitiveness can lead to an erosion of labor standards, but fortunately there are nice examples of how better work programs require, relying on transparency of firms and how they operate, lead to better conditions of working. So you don't have to sacrifice labor conditions in order to participate. But this is my final piece of evidence, which involved putting together 200 years of trade data to show you that the problems that we are confronting today are not the accidental consequences of a particular American president. They're here to stay. This light gray line is the share of Britain in world trade over the last 200 years. The dark line is the share of the United States, and the orange line is the share of China. When I used to read about the opium wars and the horrors, I had missed one interesting fact. That when the British induced the Chinese to open up their ports in the middle of the 19th century, they did not say trade only with us. They said trade with everybody. This was the age of free trade imperialism, the Pax Britannica. And that's how it continued till the Germans and Americans started to catch up. And then you see in the 1890s and early 1900s this debates in the British Parliament about how their technology is being stolen by protected markets in Japan, in Germany and the United States. And they finally, this 19th century, their share of world trade was 20%. It fell below 10% in the late 20s, and that's when you got the imperial preferences. My poor understanding of Indian economic history was as if imperial preferences was an aspect of colonialism. It came at the end. That's when they started protecting and trying to get privileged access, when their share fell below 10%. When you look at the 20th century, after the Second World War, American share of world trade was 20%. They were the pillars of the multilateral trading system. This was the Pax America. Now they accepted Europe integrating and they said MFN. First panic, Japan threatens to catch up. They induce voluntary export restraints on Japan. But the final panic came even before President Trump. And by an amazing coincidence, the American share fell below 10%. And it came with the TPP. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, can be thought of as a modern day imperial preferences. It came 10 years after they ushered China into the world trading system. It was now an effort to try and exclude them. Now, the point of this is that this is a deep structural, and I don't mean to say it's about trade alone, this is a hegemonic transition. And it's common knowledge to all of you that in the past the hegemonic transition has been costly because it disrupts the existing order in a way that is a public bad for countries like India. Now, one option, as I say somewhat half seriously, is to wait for Pax Sinica, when the Chinese share of trade grows to a share where they have a stake in creating a multilateral trading system. The other is to think of other ways of reviving multilateral cooperation. One is to deepen the traditional. One incidental point, the idea that I've seen propagated by even my own institution, that somehow this trade war is an opportunity. and India could benefit from trade diversion away from the US and China, I think is a misguided idea. I think the global uncertainty is penalizing everybody. Even Vietnam is a loser from this. And that's what some of our research shows. But in terms of deepening, I'm carrying a little bit coal back to Newcastle, or I should say Bans to Bareilly. But there is the unfinished agenda we all know about, whether it's in goods or services or non-tariff barriers. There is the problem of tariff escalation, the fact that chocolate pays a higher tariff than cocoa, so you prevent developing countries to move up from the value chain. There is a legitimate concern about distortions by subsidies and state-owned enterprises in China. But there is also, and this was proved controversial, and we suffered, was that special and differential treatment, the idea that India and China should rely on privileged treatment, we think is a misplaced idea. It is a mistake. It has meant in the past that India has never really obtained, or developing countries in general, have obtained meaningful access in areas of their interest like apparel and agriculture. And on the flip side, the pressure to implement meaningful domestic reform has never been there. And I think that has been a missed opportunity. If we are going to have meaningful trade negotiations, Manmohan Kumar's legacy has to be reframed into a more equal role of leadership, because nobody has a bigger stake in preserving an open trading system than a country like India and China. But for the reasons that I said to you, we cannot rely on narrow tunnel vision of trade cooperation, that we need cooperation on taxation, because that's the only way you can get around this kind of prisoner's dilemma that we have, where each country is cutting its corporate tax rates in order to try and attract capital or deal with. I think there are new ideas in the report of how destination-based taxation, the kind that India is contemplating in the United States, must be explored and might be a way of eliminating these distortionary incentives to shift profits or compete in taxes. We also talk about how there is a need for greater cooperation on competition policy, especially now there are these new giants emerging in areas like services and distribution, and we can talk more about that. We talk about data flows and how they are the lifeblood of global value chains, but there is a tension with national privacy regulation. Some countries like the US and EU have begun to negotiate agreements which are very interesting, where the exporter is committing to adhere to the standards of the importer in order to ensure a free flow of data. The risk is that countries like India could be excluded. Our preliminary work with the NASSCOM and the Data Security Council of India shows that they are already paying a tax in terms of compliance with European regulation. And there is a real risk that trade could be according to the pattern of mutual trust rather than comparative advantage. So how we can multilateralize these arrangements is crucial. And finally, on the environment, there's really no question that we need greater, stronger national policy on the environment, whether it's carbon taxes or tradable permits, or just stronger regulation to ensure that the gains from hyper-specialization are sustainable. Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Brookings India, and what a wonderful presentation, Aditya. As always, please join us here. Yeah. Just a couple of slides. So thank you, Aditya, for a wonderful presentation. And given in the interest of time, we are going to go to two discussants. Harsha, she says that since you are announced first, so 10 to 15 minutes. 15, please take as the upper limit, and again, around 10 minutes and 15 minutes. Yeah, I'll stop you. You know, why this is such an interesting topic in the context of what is happening is, firstly, the trade discipline that is losing steam, the way it has, we have observed over the last few years. So it has to be seen in the backdrop of what the trade indiscipline, or maybe the multilateral discipline that is getting diluted. It reminds me, Aditya, of a Japanese economist, which I am fond of quoting Kaname Akamatsu, who introduced the concept of flying geese phenomena in sometime in 1930s. So the basis of this GVC and global value chain, I see from the shifting comparative advantage and fragmentation that is becoming so important. One thing that before I give it to Harsha is I could have said it later, but I know I won't get time because there are going to be questions. The apparel story that you have narrated has also a lot to do with the SSI reservations that we had put on it. So even when the day dawned, we couldn't do much. One other point on the car industry is the cars are protected effectively at 250%, because that is 100% versus components at 15%. So strange story in India of the car industry. And lastly, I think GVC markup has a lot to do with innovation. So the IP holders of Apple phone would get a lot out of $600 worth of export that China does rather than what China gets. But without without any prejudice, GVC, I buy what you are saying, that India has missed it, but India can still do it, and that is in the interest of many things that I am not allowed to speak now, because I think I am giving it to Harsha for taking it forward. 10 minutes, Harsha. Stop you at 15.
Thank you very much. And really deep thinking. And I congratulate you, Dr. Mattu, on your presentation. It raised a lot of very pertinent questions and also indicated the answers. You addressed the world of global value chains as well as the specific situation of India, and then went on to cooperation, coordination, the trading regimes which are suitable. So I'll just take a step back and share with you and the audience some thoughts as they emerged in my mind when I was hearing you. Basically, my first thought is that deep reform is required, but deep reform per se does not really indicate what is required. Because at one level, we talk about the first generation of reforms, second generation of reforms, etc. But if we go to the characteristic of a global value chain, a global value chain involves a timely response, which needs a quick turnaround period, logistics, etc. It requires consistent, and you mentioned these things, so I'm just trying to put them together in terms of what kind of reform. So consistent standards and quality, because if one part of the chain doesn't fit into the other part of the chain, and standards actually are not just public standards, but private standards, because there has to be some entity managing this chain, and it's the lead firm. You actually mentioned the lead firm also. And different lead firms can have their own associated private standards. And whichever is the coordinator or the main supplier, you mentioned, for example, Foxconn and Apple, they themselves have to deal with each individual stage of that chain. For instance, Foxconn in India deals with 200 different kinds of firms, small scale firms themselves, leave alone the larger parts. It has, so you basically don't have just a chain, you have a web. Suppose I just draw a diagram with points of different inputs which are coming in. Each of these points will have their own value chain. And therefore, there is a whole set of coordination initiatives. Call it policy, call it a commercial initiative, which is required for just-in-time, turnaround, consistent quality inputs coming in the chain. So what is important is that policy has to be facilitating. So that's a deep reform. Policy should not introduce any uncertainty, because the moment you introduce uncertainty, then you are basically creating an environment where timely response, what is the correct timely response, cannot take place. And when you talk of lead firms, you're actually talking of MNCs. And you yourself pointed out that a lot of the global value chain initiatives are a result of firm-to-firm initiatives. And UNCTAD has found out that in the global value chains, it's a dated estimate, 80% of global value chains is actually due to MNCs. So that brings us to the issue of investment. And when you are trying to enter the world of global value chains, you actually are competing with multiple countries which are part of this web. These countries themselves try and attract this investment through incentives and creating ease of doing business, which we have been going up on the scale. But ease of doing business is a package deal. It's not component by component. There is a reason why Vietnam is mentioned so many times. If you go to Vietnam, you will find that they actually provide specific zones where power is consistently provided with a good quality, where roads are made in such a way that you are not further from the airport or the port more than 2 to 4 hours. And they focus on specific sectors which they are looking at. And the focus is on exports. India has not done badly in terms of FDI compared to Vietnam. But most of Indian FDI is focused on the domestic market, while most of Vietnam's FDI is focused on the external market. By definition, that is a higher participation in global value chains. The other aspect is that Vietnam identifies lead firms, invites them, facilitates them. As a policy till now, and I believe we are going to change in India on that, we have tried to deal everybody the same way. It doesn't matter if it's an Apple or it's some small firm which wants to invest here. And secondly, what all this requires is coordination. The policies which work to really give a thrust for global value chains is if you can create the conditions of a global export hub. The difference between somebody participating in a global value chain and a global export hub is that if there are 6 different policies which go together into creating an environment and you focus on 1 or 2 or 3 at a time, you will not be able to create a global export hub. You have to actually coordinate and work in a comprehensive, coordinated manner to create an export hub. So it's a policy chain together with a value chain of production, and both need huge coordination, which means among policy makers also you need coordination. And if different policy areas are under different ministries, there has to be a mechanism both to coordinate, monitor, and then address whatever is not achieved in a timely manner. Vietnam has this. India has started working on it. In some areas, we are improving in that. So basically, this is the domestic environment. Then firms come, if they come for exports, they need external markets. External markets means what is the condition which you are facing when you are selling your products abroad. Among the reasons why Bangladesh has done so well in apparel and it's now started focusing on pharmaceuticals is that it actually focused on large MNCs, the European and, I'm talking about apparel now, European and American coalition of firms worked to create large firms. The statistic you gave on China versus India is not the same as Bangladesh and India in terms of large companies and small companies, but it's not too different. Bangladesh also, the companies involved in apparel trade are very large. In China, if some global purchaser goes and asks for export orders to be processed, which they don't consider as large, they tell them, why don't you go to India? So if you are not able to deal with large buyers, large processors, these are the true lead firms in a value chain. You will not do as well as others in a value chain context, in a competitive context. Because you very rightly pointed out that now the factors which are affecting competitiveness are not the conventional factors. In fact, in your graph, you said this is like the imperial tariff preference. Much more than tariff preference today is to develop a process to deal with non-tariff measures. So if you go to TPP, for instance, there is a provision which says your exports are not selling to the extent that you feel that they should be sold in terms of access to my market. You can bring this issue to me, and in a timely manner, I will seek a response together with you. So the FTAs which have come, and India has done its own FTAs, but the same countries with which India has done its FTAs have deeper FTAs with others. So the deeper reform you talked about are also reflected in the deeper FTAs. And an essential part of those FTAs is a timely reaction. So the coordination bit has to be done domestically. At the same time, one can have regulatory coordination amongst nations because, and in that context, you also have to then see whether your own system is consistent with the global system. Yesterday, somebody gave me an example of an electronic product being sold. There is a BIS standard where the label is specified that it should be pasted in one part of the product or one part of the box. The international standard everywhere else is another place. We should have learned by now to actually have the same standard. But those who export from India have to create conditions. If it is on the product, suppose it's a technologically advanced product, you have to create the safe conditions to open the box, to put a label without contaminating the product, which a technologically sophisticated product can get contaminated quite easily, and change the labels, mid-Cs, high Cs. So when you have this, when you have a policy where you notify different clarifications, where you are supposed to get a refund, the time of refund. So a lot of these ease of doing business kind of policies have to be seen in terms of implementation. Because Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia start focusing on individual firm level things, they don't treat everybody the same way. These large firms are given preferential treatment. And since they have a large impact on GVCs, they end up performing much better there. Bangladesh, I was talking about, I mean, the LDC tariffs which Bangladesh gets in developed markets has played a large role. About 9 to 10% of the advantage comes just from there. But the other advantages are the nature in which investment takes place. Different sectors have different reasons why they are unable to link up with value chains. You have to really see the condition in which you are creating certain policy structures whose focus may be different from what the objective is if you are linking up with the value chain. If you are creating a system with higher tariffs, and there are policies in India where in order to produce something at home, you create tariffs to protect them, you actually are giving the incentive not for exports, but for the domestic market. So, in addition to deeper reform of the conventional type, one has to look at coordination, mechanisms to coordinate not only in terms of commercial aspects, which is immense. The inventory planning itself in a value chain is a major task. You mentioned Zara. Zara, when it produces a shirt, there are 20 different countries to which these parts are sent and brought together and stitched within 2 days. So, meanwhile, if I come back to the Indian situation, if I have a factory which is in Delhi, say Noida, and I have to go to the Delhi airport, and my trucks can't go out at night. And I'm talking about a true situation. They are not allowed to leave my factory at night, and I lose 10 hours or 6 hours. I've lost my competitiveness. So, deeper reform has to integrate within it a timeliness, coordination, and a follow-through on implementation, something which is not captured by the index of ease of doing business. It is not captured when the policymaker is coordinating, because the coordinate, of course, we all know that coordination between states and center, etc., is very important. So, the kind of reform which is required in the value chain, and that's very much different from conventional trade. In conventional trade, those who want to trade can actually trade. They will be facilitated if it is easy for imports, etc., because most of our exports have had import content over time. It's not as if this is new. Value chains is not a new phenomenon. But the realization of the complex coordinated set of policies and facilitation plus standards, and private standards at that, together with value chains, is this issue of how, as the larger countries are losing a foothold or their position in the global market, how is the industry reacting to preserve that larger share? And they find new and different reasons to try and qualify traded products. Together with that, earlier the focus of trade was mainly that of the producer. Today, the consumer organizations are also part of it. Therefore, the the kind of standards or issues which have to be addressed through trade are far larger. And if they are far larger, you have to run faster and faster to be in the same place, as Alice in Wonderland said. Time? Okay. So basically, the point I'm making is, one has to identify what are some of the key areas. One is, without lead firms, you cannot succeed in having a large presence in value chains. Without a coordinated effort, both in terms of policy, in terms of institutions, in terms of your conversation and agreements with nations, you cannot go ahead in a successful way. And this has to be fitted in terms of an inventory policy. So you have to really create a stable and predictable environment in which the business can plan and invest appropriately. And when investment comes, one has to really see what are the policies of your competing countries. Why are the disabilities which you have arising due to certain kind of incentives or policies not being there, and how to try and address them through different means. It's that which the world of value chain and data connectivity brings, where on the one hand, you have to work more closely together. On the second hand, you have to actually work very intensively at the granular level to compete with your policies as well as your initiatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Harshita. And it was value addition to the deeper reforms specific to the GVC rather than the conventional trade. So, Aditya, you would take this question later. When over to you, Amita. 10 minutes.
Thank you. I'll probably be briefer than 10 minutes. Thank you first to Brookings for having me here today to discuss something very relevant and very important report on GVCs and development. I think I'd like to congratulate the author, Aditya, for this very well-written report. Having said that, I have a few comments to make on the content of the report and the way it goes about discussing what I expected it to discuss. And first and foremost, I think about half of the report talks about GVCs in terms of what are GVCs. I think this is what you've also presented. In terms of fragmentation of commodities, the specialization as far as skill levels are concerned, productivity enhancement on account of segmentation of products, and how segmentation provides the opportunity for greater specialization as against what you have for a commodity as a whole, and how that's easier for countries to embark on in terms of smaller tasks or smaller parts, the ease of doing or the ease of being able to technically advance to that level and acquire specialization rather than an integrated whole. And how therefore that can become a mechanism for many of the developing countries to actually use for the purpose of both enhancing productivity, manufacturing capabilities, as well as has been shown here in terms of employment. However, what my question here is, or what I thought, or what I felt after reading the report, I've read the report and not just kind of seen what you've presented here, is that much of this is already known. I mean, theoretically, empirically, we already know what GVCs are. GVCs are not a new phenomenon. As you've yourself said, the maximum impact of the GVCs was felt prior to 2008. That trade has been GVC-led and was led till 2008, started to decline after that. The impact really reflected post-2011, 2012. These are all facts that are already listed out, presented. Many reports by many multilateral agencies have already presented this, So what is really the idea here of repeating all of that, That's one. Two, my question or my expectation of this report was really in terms of the current context. The current context being in terms of the nature of change that has occurred as far as GVCs are concerned. The GVCs are undergoing a change. I think we all, again, this is something that's known. And what is it that the developing countries can do to both adjust as well as to take advantage of GVCs still in this phase of change? And here I think I differ from what you said earlier in terms of what is happening as far as China is concerned, what is happening in terms of many of the PTAs, and how is it that India fits in, you know. When we are talking about the change in GVCs, we talk about, I think you mentioned this yourself in terms of lowering participation as far as China is concerned, the trade figures changing for China because of a lot of it being domestically provided. So this kind of a regional consolidation that's happening most significantly and most evidently in case of Southeast Asia and East Asian value chains, what is the significance that exists for a geographically proximate country like India, I think is the most relevant question that I would like to ask, you know. And I would have expected such a report to really reflect on what is it that the context is today? How is it that the context has changed from the prime time as far as GVC-led trade is concerned? And how is it that countries like ours, you see, which are so close to this very dynamic GVC hub, a GVC hub that continues to remain dynamic despite the change in the character of GVCs. I think that's what I would have wanted this report to reflect on. I'll come back to this to show you some figures in terms of India's participation as far as the East Asian and Southeast Asian value chains are concerned. But just to finish on what I expected of the report, and then as far as welfare implications, welfare aspects are concerned, I think two very important ones that you yourself raised. One is in terms of environment, which I'll not get into, that's not my area of specialization, but you also talk about, I think, female participation. And you give both sides of the evidence in terms of some cases where you have, I think, lower age groups where the female participation or the number of schools that they remain, number of years that they remain in school increases because they see opportunities later. And in another case where the number of women in school or college drop out because they see greater opportunities. I think that's for 17 or 19 age group, you know. Not giving, therefore, any kind of a concrete conclusion as far as gender aspect or gender dimension of women participation, gender aspect of GVCs as such is concerned. I think in both cases, whether it be environment, where you also give the, where you give the example of Bangladesh, but you also state that GVCs, although they increase the transparency level because of the attachment to a large multinational, do not by themselves ensure that the right conditions would be prevailing or would be existing in individual factories, firms, so to say, that are participating in the value chains. So by itself, participation in a global value chain will not ensure that the right kind of labor conditions are also existing in individual countries participating in such value chains. What then are the welfare implications that you're really talking about as far as global value chain participation is concerned? That's my second question. I'd just like you to bring out the figures that I wanted to show. Yeah, this is with respect to the backward and forward linkages. I think you'd shown a chart which was with respect to the, India's comparisons with the global integration levels. Here I show India's comparisons with ASEAN in terms of developing countries and Vietnam, of course, which has also been mentioned by you, where we see that India's this is of course with respect to goods trade. What we see is India's global value chain integration having declined as far as backward linkages are concerned from a low of 18.8 to 16.1 in the most recent data provided by Trade and Value Added Database, that is OECD WTO database. Whereas ASEAN also declines, but declines from a much higher level of integration, that is 31.4 to 28.2 in the same period. And you see Vietnam's even higher integration, 36.1, having actually increased during this time, that is at 43.6. Forward linkages, again, as far as India is concerned, falls 16.6 to around 14.9, 15. ASEAN remains the same, and Vietnam's we see to be a much lower level, but falling also. And I think here, as far as the backward linkages are concerned, they indicate the utilization of Vietnam in terms of the low-skilled labor at the lower end, which is what we really talk about when we are talking about imports into, at the domestic end, imported goods going towards the production of final goods. That is as far as backward linkages are concerned, which is again India having been endowed with similar kinds of factor endowment has not been able to take advantage of. That's one in terms of relative to the developing countries. The next slide, please. Where I just give you an indication of India's linkages with what is the most dynamic hub of global value chains, which is value added that is originating in India and entering into East and Southeast Asia's exports to the world. This would be the forward linkages as far as India is concerned with Southeast Asia, which is a fraction of the value added that's contributed by ASEAN and Vietnam. Vietnam in 2016, India's was only a fourth of Vietnam's contribution and a measly 3% of ASEAN's contribution to the regional exports to the world. And the same is true of India's GVC linkages with the sub-region of ASEAN, value added originating in India, entering into ASEAN's exports to the world, 11% of Vietnam's value addition and 1.6% of intra-ASEAN value addition. Just to say that not only are we very thinly integrated with the global value chains relative to the developing world, relative to the immediate geographically proximate region, but also within this region, which is and continues to be the most dynamic hub as far as GVCs are concerned, how our contribution to forward linkages is very, very limited. The third one, please. And here, I mean, this is just to say, again, you've given the example of both textiles as well as automobiles. Textiles and automobiles, from the data that's available, are also two of the most integrated value chain sectors in the world. These are also among India's top sectors. What we see for India in recent years is that India's GVC integration in both these sectors, most integrated as far as value chain integration globally is concerned, top sectors for India. India's value chain integration in these sectors has declined, and the import content of exports in textiles and apparel fallen from 15.3% to 13.4% in the latest figures that we have. In motor vehicles, the import content has fallen, of exports has fallen to from 23.5 to 23.5 in 2016 from 25.3 in 2005. And simultaneously, we've seen the share of India in textiles and apparel for India to fall, while as far as the the export share in the motor vehicle sector is concerned, it has remained stagnant at very, very low levels or insignificant levels. And on top of that, India in the recent budgets in 2018 and 2019 has increased import duty in components for both textiles and apparel in budget 2018 and auto parts in 2019. And we'll probably see domestic commodities or domestic inputs actually substituting for imported goods in these commodity sectors, which are the most integrated, which are top export sectors for us, giving an indication of India's move or India's inclination for participation as far as global value chains are concerned, which according to me should be one of the most important policy measures for India, given the evidence that has been given in today's presentation, as well as what we've seen from many other studies, that you have a direct relationship with employment creation if you have an integration or if you increase your GVC integration. My last point is about PTAs. I think that's also something that you mentioned in your report, that participation in preferential trading agreements would facilitate the GVC participation. Because of reforms. Two, I think there is a dual causality between GVCs, which calls for multiple border crossing of commodities, which could be intermediate or final commodities, as well as PTAs that look for like-minded countries who want which would want similar kind of trade rules for this kind of multiple crossing of commodities to be facilitated. So PTAs is an important vehicle for any country to participate in GVCs. Your comment on RCEP, I think I would differ from that RCEP was an important vehicle for India to have entered into the GVCs. Regional GVCs in particular that would have facilitated, particularly given that we have another PTA operational in the region that is already under implementation, which is the CPTPP. Many of the ASEAN countries today have the option of joining the CPTPP, and while we have kind of given the decision not to participate, to withdraw from that, I think we still have some time to be able to join the RCEP if at all we are thinking about it. But I think it's an important policy reflection as far as India is concerned when we decide not to join an important vehicle instrument for GVC participation. I think I'll stop here and come back to some of these points if there is any interest.
Thank you, Amita. Keeping to 10 minutes, and I think I'll open up the discussion, floor discussion, and I would tend to emphasize that RCEP discussion, Aditya, if you can tell us a little more about, because what we find in the high-level advisory group report is that when China and US are at trade war, India has gains, and RCEP, joining RCEP when China is still at trade war with US gives us even better gains. So this is a paper in the high-level advisory group, which three days before the PM had to go to RCEP discussion was released by Dr. Surjit Bhalla and was all over. So RCEP by the minister. So Surjit was the chair of the
High-level group.
High level. So there was some discussion on it, and 3 days later we found we are not joining. So RCEP is one. And one other thing that I always keep wondering, and have not, I have not studied that, but any comments on Baldwin's, hubs and spokes, that there is a factory in North America, there is a factory Asia, factory Europe, Germany, US and Japan are the hubs, and others are spokes. I have not understood it. Please don't take that as my question today, but that is yet another complexity when he says that this is not GVC, this is all regional. I am opening up and start with Suman.